Pela was meant to be a DPS unit. I know that might be hard to believe. She's commonly used as an SP positive support unit. With her 40% AoE death shred and permanent ult uptime, most won't even consider running her to do anything else than basic spam. But from her eidolons and her bonus traces, it's obvious that Hoyoverse was pushing her to be one. Both Bash and Wipeout increase Pela's damage percent. Her E4 reduces Ice Res, which can arguably be supportive alongside Ice DPSs. And her E6 adds an extra MV to Pela's attacks against debuffed enemies. To me, this is very weird, because only around half of the enemy cast have cleansable buffs, and making her skill damage increase dependent on that is going to be clunky at best. Assuming we play her the intended way and skill spam, it would feel weird using SP for a skill that rarely will proc the secondary effect. The light cone that features her in the art is Good Night and Sleep Well, which increases the wearer's damage the more debuffs the enemy has. Admittedly, Pela cannot capitalize this light cone whatsoever, and that light cones can feature characters that aren't in the path, but I did find this fact off-putting since she can use it. The ace in the hole, however, is how they coded her to act during autoplay. Everyone's played with an auto Pela before, and she's infamously horrible. She will always use her skill, even if the enemy doesn't have any buffs to dispel. She was given the same auto-battle tendencies as a DPS unit, but the community has found a different use for her, and I honestly prefer her being a 2-turn ult bot rather than the mess Hoyoverse cooked up with her dispelling single target skill, because NIHILITY is a path that's focused on dealing more damage, which leads me to my next point, and the main topic of this video. The NIHILITY path's identity is extremely muddled as of now. Per the game's description, applies debuffs to enemies to reduce their combat capabilities. There's a handful of debuffs in this game, but I'll separate them into two categories for now: stat debuffs and damage over time. In short, dots. I'll cover dots first. Kafka and Sampo are NIHILITY units that just feel like destruction characters to me. Their entire kits revolve around dots and increasing damage the enemies take from them. None of this actually reduce their combat capabilities, unless of course you consider an early death to be a debuff. Luca and Gwynaifen also feel like they're hunt and destruction respectively, but I think they get a pass due to both of them applying vulnerability, so that non-dot units can also cash in the extra damage. Of course, I think dots are fine and should exist in the game, but having it be the main identity of NIHILITY feels a little weird. The simulated universe NIHILITY path is mostly increasing dot damage, and I suspect that most NIHILITY units moving forward are going to be focused on dots rather than debuffs. The stat debuffers are Welt, Silverwolf, and Pela. I think they are exactly what NIHILITY entails, with the 5 stars having a little bit of extra spice on top. Silverwolf shreds death, has a variety of mini debuffs, and implants weaknesses. Welt can apply slows, vulnerability, and can force imprison on enemies. Crowd control is very useful for stopping enemies from doing their annoying gimmicks. Not only are NIHILITY units split into two main groups, but their place in the meta right now is odd. The aforementioned dot units are usually just seen clumped up together with Kafka being the core of those teams. Other than that, you rarely see the other units stand on their own, except maybe Gwynaifen being able to support Hook, and Luca E6 serving as a decent physical hunt character. The stat debuffers, on the other hand, are even more niche. Silverwolf needs to be played in either a mono quantum setup, or she needs to be paired with 2-2 elemental splits, which can be hard to coordinate if you don't have a sustainer or flex unit for every element. I rarely see people play well, and when they do, they're usually running him as a crit main DPS or a sub DPS who's brought along for his imprison. I don't see his utility seeing all too much synergy with other units. And whenever DPS Welt is brought up, Daniel comparisons are soon to follow. Pela is a great SP positive support. She's got a very low investment cost since you only have to max out her ultimate and you only need to raise her talent to around level 5 or 7. The problem with Pela, however, is that her supportive capabilities don't scale with eidolons, and that she doesn't provide enough stat debuffs. The only teams I can think that are optimal with Pela are Jingliu's teams and other Ice DPS teams. I think that Pela is playable in almost every team, but it's rare to find a spot that she'll be the best in. It's usually better to run Harmony units instead of Pela if you can afford some SP. Harmony units are the opposite of NIHILITY units. they give buffs to their allies to let them do more things in combat. But the power gap between the stat buffs that Harmony gives and the debuffs that current Nihility units is quite large. It is important to note that Harmony units do suffer from diminishing returns. Diminishing returns is a concept where the more of one stat that you add onto a character, the less returns that you'll see in damage output. But if you're on 2 Harmony units, you'll barely even notice it because of the absurdly high stat values they give in the first place. Not to mention that these units usually give a wide variety of buffs. Asta gives 50 speed and 60% attack, Tingyun gives 65% attack, 50% damage, and 50 energy, and 50 extra MV on top of that. Having a variety of buffs is strong, because not only does it reduce diminishing returns, but also stats like attack percent and damage percent are multiplicative of one another. At this point, diminishing returns are negligible. For a comparison, Pela's roughly a 21% damage increase, Tingyun's a 70% damage increase, and Bronya can range from a 100% to 200% damage increase. I'll leave these rough calcs in the description if you want to check it out. Okay, so Harmony units are strong, so what, right? After all, I've only said that stat debuffers are understated, and that both Silverwolf and Welt have their niche use cases. My problem is that all the new Nihility units post Silverwolf are just sub DPS dot units, and just have one extra debuff on top of it. Being a sub DPS means your damage will be subpar, and since they only have one extra debuff such as Luca or Gwynaifen's vulnerability, their supportive capabilities are nowhere near the Harmony units. The optimal way to use them is with Kafka, who can reproc dots. You could make an argument that Harmonies are also only used alongside hypercarries, but you can make so many units into a hypercarry while dots only have Kafka. What Hoyo Lab is cooking are sub DPSs with backloaded damage, so that they don't surpass the real offensive paths. It's very simplistic, and in theory, it makes sense. But at the same time, this would make them have a much steeper relic investment cost than Harmony units. Nihility units will have to build a mix of speed, attack, EHR, and occasionally break effect to function, while Harmony units would only need to build speed, and the stats their buffs scale off. Tingyun needs attack, Hanya needs speed, Bronya scales off crit damage. Being able to drop the EHR stat means that Harmonies are way easier to build and have much more freedom with their build. Another edge that Harmonies have is buff and debuffs intrinsic behavior. If you place a debuff on a wave and clear that wave immediately, the debuff's value will end there. If you buff an ally, they keep that buff until the duration ends. You get the maximum value every time. I'm afraid there isn't much you can do about this fact though, other than removing ads, creeps, or mobs, and maybe having a unit that transfers the debuffs of dead enemies onto adjacent or new ones. To get the full value of these debuffs, the content would need to have enemies that have high HP and def. Extended fights in general would be good for Nihilities. On the other hand, Nihilities contribute to breaking toughness bars way more than Harmonies generally do. However, with Ruan Mei on the horizon, I have a feeling this will be irrelevant since Ruan Mei boosts break effect. Doing what Nihility does, but better. So, how would you go around balancing Nihility units? Well, game balance is fickle and subjective. Instead, I'll offer a bunch of different approaches that Hoyo Lab can take. I know that Hoyo Lab rarely ever buffs characters, so this perspective is based on future Nihility releases instead of retroactive changes. For the dot-focused sub-DPS characters, they're quite mid when they don't have Kafka, but Kafka's such a monstrosity of a character that it's hard to make new dot characters without indirectly making Kafka stronger. Ironically, the best way to tackle it is to increase these dot characters' skill multipliers, and not their dot multipliers. This way, Kafka's reprocs don't increase significantly, while making these units be able to stand on their own. For new stat debuff characters, the way to do it is just to straight up give them more stat debuffs, and a larger variety of them. Rest Shred, Def Shred, Vulnerability, extra MV on hit are all great debuffs that are going to be multiplicative of one another, and all of them with different scalings. And finally, for the oddities like Welt, my only request is to make more of them. Despite all this yapping, I'm looking forward to more Nihility units to come, and I know that this most likely will never reach or change units that Hoyo Lab's designing, but I thought it would be worth it to let my thoughts on game design and balance be heard out there. I think all the Nihility units are fine. since they at least have their niches. I know that the thumbnail is outrageous, but that's just how you get the clicks these days. Attack percent, damage percent, crit percent, vulnerability, rest shred all scale linearly and are multiplicative of one another. This means that you want to have a mix of all of these stats so that they multiply, and balance them so that you won't be losing too much value off the diminishing returns. But for harmony and nihility units, the only way for you as the player to balance them is to slot in the strongest units to the 2 precious team flex slots that you're given. It's just a matter of fact that the unit with the biggest stats and the widest variety of stats wins out in the end. Once again, the balancing act is unit based. It's too bad that nihility is unit cringe. That's it for me. My name is Kyte, and thanks for watching. I know ranting isn't usually what I do, but I hope you enjoyed it. Please consider subscribing for more HSR madness. See ya!